What's going on, everybody? In this video, I want to give you a quick overview of how I make the animations for my beginner series. So every time I post a video, I get a couple of comments asking how did I do the graphs, or where people can get this tool that I'm using to make the animations. Well, I developed the tool myself, and I'm going to just warn you now, it's probably a little buggy, but for quick animations and playing around with graphs and simple math expressions, I think it's pretty fun and could be a useful tool to use. So I want to give you a quick overview of how I use it, how to make an animation in it, and how to graph a few things. So let's take a look. I'll put a link to it in the description. It's on GitHub. And what you're going to do is go to that link and then clone the repository. So you can just download a zip file of it. And then when you extract that zip, you'll see an index.html. And if you open that up, and I have it already on my computer here, you'll see this. So this is the tool itself. You have all these menu items over here, some colors, and some frames of your animation. And then there's a whole bunch of stuff down here. So I just added this recently, this help section. And this should kind of give you an idea of how to do like the basic stuff in the program. So we can go over this in this video. And it's here for when you're playing around with it yourself too. So one of the basic things that this program does is let you create simple animations. So I can get the text tool here by clicking on text and then click in the window, and I get a little text box that I can type in. So I can type some text and then hit return, and now I have this little label. Now everything has properties in the program, and so the way animation works is this has a set of properties like its color and its size and the text content, and that's associated with frame 1. Now if I change to frame 2 by clicking on it or hitting the right arrow key, I can change the properties of this text box, like clicking and dragging it over here. And now when I go back and forth from frame 1 to frame 2, you see that it kind of saved that transition. Now when I record my series, I go into something called presentation mode. So you hit Control P to go into presentation mode in the program. And then when you hit the right and left arrow keys, it gives you this bouncy transition. So you can change the transition if you don't want it to be bouncy, but I kind of like it to overshoot. So now I can go left and right on the arrow keys and see my animation. Now you hit escape to exit presentation mode. And there's a few other properties for these. Every object has these common properties, like its size. So if you hit Control and L and I scale it vertically and horizontally, so you can scale it all around. You hold Control and basically use I, J, K, and L to scale the text, and then U and O rotate it. I don't know how handy some of these are for text, but they're there if you need them. And now if we go back into presentation mode and I go to the next frame, you see that everything, all the properties smoothly transition. So it lets you make these kind of cool little animations. So we'll escape presentation mode by hitting the escape key. Now you can select something and just delete it if you don't want it anymore, and that will delete it for every single frame. So to delete, you can go over here to delete in the menu, or you can hold Control and hit delete. Now there's a few other things that you can create. So you can make a shape, which is just a bunch of lines. You just click around here using the shape tool and then escape to finish drawing your shape, and you can kind of close it up there and animate your shape if you want. So I went to the next frame by hitting the right arrow key, and I can move some points around, and then we can go back and forth here, and it just transitions the points. You can change the color, so you select a few points and change the color by clicking on one of these over here, and it will transition the color as well. We'll delete that shape. You can make a vector which is just like a line with an arrow on it. And you can animate that as well. So go into presentation mode and you can see you get a little animated vector. Delete that. You can make some circles and select them again using I, J, K, and L to scale them like this. And then U and O, rotate them left and right. So you can make some circles. And of course you can animate, so you can go to frame 2 and move it around and rotate it like this. And then you can go to frame 3 and move it even further and rotate it back again and scale it up. And now if we go to our animation, starting at frame 1 to 2 and then to 3. And you can go backwards too, of course, so you can go back to frame 1. And if you want more frames, I typically build out an animation, you know, frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, and then I'll want another frame, so I'll just hit this create frame and go to frame 4, and that will let me, you know, have more transitions in my animation. So we'll delete this and go back to frame 1. Now let's do some math stuff. So with these text boxes, you can do certain things. Like you can make a variable called x and assign it to the value of 5. And when I hit return, that evaluates this text. And now x, the variable x, has the value 5. And then to see what the value of x is, you have to use an expression text. So you type E and then a colon. And everything in this following this E and colon will be executed every frame, and it will also show a little evaluation of what its value is. So if I put an x here, it should tell me that it's equal to 5. Yes. Now when you present, I just remove any sort of colon operator before the x so that it looks a little cleaner, right? So we can change the value of x up here, like saying it's 2. And you see that the expression shows the new value for x. Now you can have multiple text boxes and multiple assignments, and you can click on them. So if I hit shift return, that will make a text box immediately under the text box that was selected. It's just a neat way to create text boxes. And I could say, you know, x equals 3, shift return x equals 4, and x equals 5. And now I can click on these and they'll be evaluated. They're like run, you know? So it's like x equals 2, and you can see that the value changes, and x equals 4, and the value changes. So that's a basic way to play around with variables. We can do more complicated expressions like x equals x plus 1. And now I can run this, and every time I click on this, it's going to add 1 to the value of x. So click, 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 and it's just kind of counting up x, right? Now, like I said before, expressions are evaluated every frame. So if I say that this is an expression and I hit return, you can see that x is going to start counting up every single frame of animation. And this thing runs at about 60 frames per second. So these are handy if you want to make moving graphs and stuff like that. We'll see in a second. Another way to play with variable values is to use something called a slider. So we'll go back to a text box and we'll type slide x, slide colon x, and then when we're in presentation mode, you can click and drag left and right and change the value of x slowly and smoothly, you know, not just like 2, 3, 4, not just assign it to a value instantly. You can just drag it and it will slowly change. And if you hold command, it should change a lot slower. So that's if you want some fine grained control over it. So that's a slider. I'll remove all that stuff. And let's look at functions first. So you can define a function like this: f of x equals sine of x, let's say. And by hitting return, I've defined this function, And now I can make a text box, an evaluation text box, and say, what is f of 2? And it's telling me it's 0.91. Or what is f of pi over 2? And that should be 0. Oh, no, sine of that. Okay, sine of pi over 2 is 1, so that's right. Let's see, sine of pi should be 0. Yeah. So this is evaluating the function on its input and telling us what the evaluation is. So that's how to define a function. Let's look at how to graph a function. So if you want to graph, you make another expression. And graphing is just another function. So you say graph f. And there you can see that's a graph of the sine function. Now, you can move the graph around using something called the camera. So we'll take a brief detour on how to move the graph around using the camera. So we'll hit the C key, or you can click camera over here. And now when I click and drag, we can move the coordinate system around. And if I control click and drag, you can see that we can rotate the camera. So it's actually a three-dimensional camera. And we can see our graph there on the X and Y axes. You can animate the camera as well, which I sometimes do. So we're on frame 1. And then if I go to frame 2, you can see that it already had some properties here, and it went back to its starting position. So now frame 1 has the camera here, frame 2 has it here, and if we go into presentation mode, you can see that it smoothly transitions the camera positions. So that can come in handy. Now, let's use some sliders in our graph to make it more interactive. So let's say we want 2 variables, slide A and slide B, and we'll make A change the variable inside here and B change the variable outside. Now we go into presentation mode, and we have to give these some initial values by sliding them. And we'll go back to this front on camera here. Now you can kind of play around with your graph, right? So A is kind of changing the frequency. A higher value of A will make X have larger increments, and so you'll see more of these sine waves. And a higher B should scale them up vertically, so we can make a higher B and they get taller or shorter. So that's kind of handy if you want to play around with graphs, right? Like we could do the sigmoid graph. We could say define a new function. Oh, we'll replace whatever f was and say that it's 1 over 1 plus e to the negative x, and make sure that that's e raised to exponential. Okay? So we have our sigmoid function, but we could, scale x by a and scale the whole thing by b here. And now we can play with our values here and see how the sigmoid function changes. Right? And we could add another one, like an offset. So slide C, and put that inside with A, like a horizontal offset, right? And give that an initial value. And now we can shift it left and right and change its, orientation and its height and all that. You play around with graphs. I think the axes go from like -10 to 10 or something like this on this coordinate system. So that's playing around with graphs. There's only a few more things here. There's some special functions, like if you have a function of 2 variables, we'll call them x and z, and we'll say that's sine of x plus cosine of z. Then if we want to quickly get an idea of the surface that this function defines, we can say not graph, but surface f. And now if we change the camera, you can see that we get this lumpy surface. So this just kind of evaluates the function of 2 variables at a grid of points, and then the y-axis is the output of the function. Now there's some special values that are constantly being updated, like _x. That's the x position of the mouse relative to the coordinate system. And of course we have _y, and that's the y position of the mouse. And you can use these in your expression. So you can say f of x is sine of x plus _x, and this one's plus _y, over 2, or we could kind of slow them down. So that's going to let you make your graphs more interactive in a way, like you can just kind of move your mouse around and get an idea. You're like shifting the inputs to those trig functions, or whatever you want to do with the x and y coordinates of the mouse. So you can make some kind of cool animations with that. There's also the frame special value, and that just changes all the time. So I'm not moving the mouse, and that's just constantly counting up. Here, I'll show it to you with an expression over here. So expression frame, and that we're on frame 46,300, 400, 500. So that's going to just constantly count up if you just want something to make quick animation with, right? Now I'm going to clear all this. I'm just going to refresh this page. What else? What else can I show you? Well, let's say you make an animation. You say, hey, and then you go to frame 2 and you change this to hello, and you love your animation, and you want to save it and work on it later. You have two options. You can save it locally, and that's going to save it just using your browser's like cache information. And so if I save local and then refresh this page, I can load local, and I'll get my same animation I had before. But if you want to save it for long term, you can go down here and put a file name in, test, and I usually put an extension .anim on them. You don't have to put an extension. And then you hit save. That will save this file to your downloads folder, and then I can clear this out. And to load a file, you go down here and pick it under load file, and you go to your downloads and choose the file. And if everything works correctly, you should get your same animation back. So you can save and load animations and return to them at later times. There's a few other things with matrices. So we could say A equals rand n, and that will give us a matrix of random normals. And we could have like 100 by 3. And then there's a special function scatter. And as you type a function out, if you type the function name and stop typing, it will show you the arguments that it takes and a little comment about how to use it. So most stuff has a little bit of documentation, barely, on how to use it. So we could say scatter A and run that. And now we have this like a matrix of 100 by 3 random normal points, and they're being scatter plotted in our coordinate system. Now to zoom the camera in, you use I and L again, so you can kind of come in here and get a better look, and then hold command when you have the camera tool selected and rotate the scatter plot around. There's a few other special functions that you'll just have to look in the code to find, like you can create a rotation matrix, and you can print out the contents of a matrix as well. And I think that's pretty much it. Let me know if you have any other questions. You should have a pretty good idea of how to make a simple graph and play around with it with some sliders. And that's mainly what this thing is for. And then you can make some more complicated animations using these frames if you want to. You don't even have to use these keyframes. They're more for my presentations in my beginner series. So anyways, I hope you didn't fall asleep during that and you find this useful. And I'm working on my intermediate series. So we're going to cover stuff like matrices and vectors and why they're used in big, giant neural networks. it's mostly about organization of all your parameters. And we'll talk about a whole bunch of other stuff. So I'm working on that, and it feels good to be back from the holidays, and I'm glad to get another video out for you guys. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.